Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the Great Hall of the Galactic Council, watching 47 different alien species take their seats around the massive circular chamber. The walls rose high above them, covered in symbols from every world that belonged to the Council. Light streamed down from the crystal dome overhead, casting rainbow patterns across the floor, where representatives from across the galaxy gathered for what everyone knew would be a historic vote. Jake had been coming to these meetings for 15 years now, and he had never seen the chamber so tense. Whispered conversations in dozens of languages filled the air, while delegates avoided looking at the human section. The humans sat together in their designated area, wearing their dark blue uniforms with Earth's symbol proudly displayed on their shoulders. There were 12 of them representing humanity's voice in the council, but Jake could feel that number was about to change. Dr. Lisa Grant sat beside him, adjusting her tablet as she reviewed the voting records one more time. As Earth's chief diplomatic advisor, she had spent months trying to prevent this moment from arriving. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her face showed the stress of the past few weeks. She had called in every favor and made every argument she could think of, but the momentum against humanity had grown too strong to stop. Behind them sat the other members of the human delegation, including Captain Steve Parker, who commanded the Council's Joint Defense Fleet, and Dr. Helen Brooks, who had saved millions of alien lives during the plague outbreak on Vega Prime. These were good people who had given years of their lives serving the galaxy, and now they were about to be told their service was no longer wanted. The Council speaker raised one of his 4 arms, and the chamber fell silent. He was a tall Rigelian with blue skin and eyes that seemed to glow in the light. His voice carried clearly across the vast space as he began the formal proceedings that would decide humanity's future in the galactic community. We gathered today to vote on Resolution 47B, which proposes to adjust the representation structure of this council, he announced. The motion before us suggests reducing human representation from 12 seats to 3 seats based on concerns about military influence in civilian governance. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the familiar words. For 60 years, humans had served as the galaxy's peacekeepers, risking their lives to protect worlds they had never even visited. Human ships patrolled the dangerous border regions, where the void hunters and other threats lurked in the darkness between stars. Human soldiers had died defending alien colonies, while their own families waited at home, hoping for their safe return. The Andromedan representative stood first to speak in favor of the resolution. His tall, thin frame seemed to tower over the podium as he gestured with his long arms. While we appreciate human contributions to galactic security, we must address the growing concern that military thinking has begun to dominate council decisions, he said in his melodic voice. Peace requires civilian leadership, not warrior mentality. Several other speakers followed, each making similar arguments about the need for balance and civilian control. They spoke of humanity's aggressive nature and their tendency to see military solutions to every problem. The Vegan delegate mentioned humanity's quick response to threats as if it were somehow a bad thing. The Centauri representative worried about human expansion into other systems. Dr. Grant was given a chance to respond, and she stood slowly before walking to the speaker's podium. Her voice was calm and measured as she addressed the chamber, but Jake could hear the emotion underneath her professional tone. For 6 decades, human beings have answered every call for help that has come from this chamber, she began. We have lost over 2 million service members protecting worlds that were not our own. Our ships patrol sectors so dangerous that other Species refused to send their people there. When the Void Hunters attacked the Outer Rim, it was human blood that stopped them. When plague struck Vega Prime, it was human doctors who stayed behind to treat the sick while everyone else evacuated. She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had once called humans their greatest allies. You speak of military influence as if it were corruption, but military strength is what has kept this galaxy safe. You worry about human aggression, but that aggression has only ever been directed at those who threaten innocent lives. The chamber remained silent as she continued. If you reduce our representation, you are not promoting peace. You are announcing to every enemy of this council that the galaxy's defenders have been weakened. You are telling pirates and raiders and worse things that the time is right to strike because the humans no longer have the authority to respond quickly to threats. When she finished speaking and returned to her seat, Jake could see that her words had affected some of the delegates. The Altarian Prime Minister looked troubled, and the representatives from several smaller worlds seemed to be reconsidering their positions. But the larger species had already made up their minds, and they had the votes to get what they wanted. The vote began with each species called in alphabetical order. The Andromedans voted yes, as expected. The Arcturians followed suit. One by one, the great powers of the galaxy voted to reduce humanity's influence, while the smaller species split almost evenly between supporting and opposing the measure. Jake kept count in his head as the votes were tallied, knowing that each yes vote was another step toward disaster. When the final count was announced, the result was devastating. 39 species had voted in favor of the resolution, while only 8 had opposed it. The humans had been abandoned by the very civilizations they had spent decades protecting. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what this meant for the galaxy's future. The chamber erupted in noise as delegates began talking excitedly about the historic vote, but Jake was already standing. He walked slowly to the center of the chamber where the speaker's podium stood, and the room gradually fell quiet as everyone watched him. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence as he reached the podium and turned to face the assembled representatives. For 60 years, human blood has been spilled defending this galaxy, he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. We have asked for nothing in return except the chance to serve alongside you as equals. Today you have made your choice clear. You want our protection but not our voice. You want our sacrifice but not our influence. He reached up and removed the council insignia from his uniform collar. The small pin gleamed in the light as he held it up for everyone to see before placing it carefully on the podium. Effective immediately, all human forces are withdrawn from Council space. Our ships will return to human territory. Our soldiers will come home. Our doctors and engineers and diplomats will serve human interests instead of galactic ones. The fee. Other 11 members of the human delegation stood as one and followed Jake to the podium. Each of them removed their insignia and placed it beside his in a growing pile of rejected service. Dr. Grant was the last to add hers, and Jake could see tears in her eyes as she set it down. You wanted independence from human protection, Jake, said as the delegation prepared to leave. You have it. We wish you luck. You are going to need it. The humans walked out of the chamber in silence, while behind them 47 species sat in stunned disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The greatest military force in the galaxy had just withdrawn its protection, and suddenly the universe felt much more dangerous than it had moments before. Captain Ryan Brooks was reviewing patrol reports on the bridge of the UES Liberty when the priority message arrived from Earth Command. The massive battleship was currently escorting a convoy of Vegan merchant vessels through the dangerous Kepler system where pirate attacks had been increasing over the past month. His crew of 800 had been on station for 6 weeks, and they were looking forward to rotating back to Earth for some well-deserved leave. The communication officer, Lieutenant Kelly Nash, looked up from her station with a confused expression on her face. "Captain, we have an urgent message from Fleet Command marked with the highest priority codes," she announced. "It's addressed to all human forces operating in Council space." Ryan took the message pad and read it twice before the words fully registered in his mind. The withdrawal order was clear and immediate. All human military forces were to cease operations in Council territory and return to human space within 72 hours. No exceptions were mentioned, and no explanations were given beyond a reference to Council Resolution 47B. "All hands, this is the captain," Ryan announced over the ship's communication system. "By direct order of Earth Command, we are immediately ceasing all Council protection duties and returning to human space." The bridge fell completely silent as his crew tried to process what they had just heard. Many of these people had spent their entire careers protecting alien worlds, and the sudden change left them feeling lost. Kelly raised her hand tentatively before speaking. "Sir, what about the Vegan convoy we're escorting?" she asked. "They still have 12 hours before they reach the safety of the inner system." The merchant ships were carrying medical supplies to colonies that desperately needed them, and without escort, they would be sitting targets for any pirates operating in the area. Ryan looked out at the convoy of slow-moving cargo vessels that his ship had been protecting for the past 3 days. These weren't the aliens who had voted against humanity in the Council. These were simple traders trying to make a living by moving goods between worlds. They had families waiting for them at home just like his own crew did. "We complete this escort mission," he decided. "Then we head for Earth." It might technically violate the spirit of his orders, but Ryan refused to abandon innocent civilians to pirates just because politicians had made stupid decisions. His duty was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that duty didn't end because of a vote in some distant chamber. Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy as human commanders received their withdrawal orders. On the frontier, World of Kepler 7 Commander Alex Stone was pulling his forces back from defensive positions they had held for 3 years. His soldiers had built relationships with the local population, and many of them were married to aliens who would now be left behind enemy lines. Alex stood in his command bunker, looking at tactical displays that showed Void Hunter forces massing just beyond the system's edge. Without human forces to hold the line, the planet would fall within days. The local defense forces were brave, but they lacked the training and equipment needed to stop a serious attack. "Sir, the evacuation transports are ready," reported Major Kate Williams, who served as his second in command. "But the civilian population is panicking. They want to know why we're leaving them defenseless." Kate had spent 2 years training the local militia, and she knew better than anyone how unprepared they were for what was coming. "Orders are orders," Alex replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Earth Command wants all forces withdrawn, and that includes us." He hated leaving these people behind, but he also understood the bigger picture. The Council had made its choice, and now everyone would have to live with the consequences. Dr. Richard Hayes was packing his medical supplies at the Council space station orbiting Rigel Prime when his Altarian colleague approached him with desperate eyes. The space station served as a major medical center for the region, and Dr. Hayes had been running the trauma ward for the past 5 years. His expertise in treating combat injuries had saved thousands of lives, and his departure would leave a gap that couldn't be easily filled. "Richard, you can't leave now," pleaded Dr. Kent, who had worked alongside him since his arrival. "We have incoming casualties from the border conflicts, and nobody else knows your surgical techniques." The Altarian physician had learned much from working with humans, but he wasn't ready to handle the most serious cases on his own. "I'm sorry, but this isn't our fight anymore," Richard replied as he sealed the last container of medical equipment. "The council made it clear that human involvement isn't wanted, so we're going home." It broke his heart to leave patients who needed his help, but the decision had been made at levels far above his authority. The withdrawal continued across dozens of star systems as human forces packed up equipment they had spent years deploying. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Foster supervised the evacuation of a forward operating base that had served as humanity's eyes and ears in the Outer Rim. The intelligence gathered at this base had prevented countless attacks over the past decade, but now it would go dark. "What about our alien allies?" asked Sergeant Tony Miller as he helped load the last transport. "Some of these people have been fighting alongside us for years." Tony had formed close friendships with local soldiers, and the thought of abandoning them felt like betrayal. "They'll have to manage without us," Danny replied grimly. "Maybe this will teach the council the value of what they're throwing away." He hoped the lesson wouldn't cost too many innocent lives, but that was no longer his responsibility to worry about. On board the medical vessel UES Mercy, Dr. Susan Clark was saying goodbye to the alien patients she had been treating for various injuries and illnesses. The ship had been providing medical aid to refugee camps in the disputed border regions where constant fighting had displaced millions of civilians. Now those refugees would have to find help elsewhere. "Doctor, please don't." "Go," begged a young Centauri mother whose child was still recovering from surgery. "My daughter needs your care." The little girl had been badly injured in a pirate attack, and Dr. Clark's experimental treatment was the only thing keeping her alive. "I'm leaving detailed instructions with the local medical staff," Susan said as gently as she could. "They'll take good care of her." It wasn't entirely true, since the local doctors lacked the equipment and training to continue the treatment, but Susan couldn't stay behind when her orders were clear. Captain Jennifer Stone commanded the destroyer UES Defiance, which had been patrolling the shipping lanes near the Vega system for the past 8 months. Her ship had single-handedly stopped 3 major pirate raids, and her crew had become heroes to the local merchant community. Now they were leaving, just as intelligence reports suggested a major attack was being planned. "Captain, we're receiving distress calls from multiple merchant vessels," reported her tactical officer, Lieutenant Carl Johnson. "They're begging us to stay until the local defense forces can be reinforced." The merchants knew they would be sitting ducks without human protection, and their desperation was clear in every transmission. "Log the requests, but maintain course for Earth," Jennifer ordered. "We're no longer responsible for protecting Council shipping." She felt sick saying the words, but her duty was to follow orders, not to make policy decisions that were above her rank. As human forces streamed back toward Earth space, the galaxy began to realize what it had lost. Shipping companies started canceling routes through dangerous sectors. Colonial governments began emergency evacuations of frontier settlements. Defense contractors scrambled to fill orders for weapons and equipment that human forces had been providing. On Earth, Admiral Jake Morrison watched the returning fleets with mixed emotions. He was proud that his people had followed orders without question, but he also knew what their withdrawal would mean for galactic security. The Council would learn its lesson, but the price would be paid in innocent blood. The last human ship left Council space exactly 71 hours and 37 minutes after the withdrawal order was issued. Behind them, they left empty bases, abandoned allies, and a galaxy that was about to discover just how dangerous the universe could be without human protection. 3 months after the last human ship disappeared from Council space, the galaxy learned its first hard lesson about life without human protection. The attack came without warning as 7 Void Hunter fleets emerged from the dark space between stars and struck simultaneously across the Outer Rim territories. What should have been a minor raid became a devastating assault that shattered the unprepared defenses of 3 star systems. President Elena Rodriguez sat in her office on Earth, reading the casualty reports that intelligence services had intercepted from Council communications. The numbers were staggering and growing worse with each update. The Vega system had fallen completely after only 6 hours of fighting. Tau Ceti was under siege, with enemy forces controlling the orbital platforms. The Kepler colonies had been evacuated, but not before millions of civilians were killed or captured. General Peter Clark stood beside the president's desk, updating her on the unfolding disaster. As Earth's military advisor, he had access to detailed intelligence about the Council's desperate attempts to respond to the crisis. The emergency response fleet was destroyed trying to reach Tau Ceti, he reported. They lost 4 battleships and 12 escort vessels in the first engagement. What about casualties among our former allies? Elena asked, even though she dreaded hearing the answer. Despite the political betrayal, these were still people who had worked alongside humans for decades. Many of them had families and friends who were now paying the price for their leaders' poor decisions. Conservative estimates put civilian deaths at 40 million and climbing. Peter replied grimly. The Council species simply don't have the military coordination that humans provided. They're fighting as individual fleets instead of a unified force. Each species is trying to protect its own territory, while the enemy moves freely between systems. On the Council flagship, Admiral Kethvar of the Rigelian Republic struggled to maintain order among the fractured alliance. The blue-skinned officer had served alongside human forces for 20 years, and he understood better than most what the galaxy had lost when humanity withdrew. His bridge crew monitored communications from across Council space as desperate calls for help flooded the networks. "Sir, the Andromedan Third Fleet is requesting immediate support," reported his communications officer. "They're facing a force 3 times their size, and they're taking heavy casualties." The same Andromedans who had led the vote against humanity were now begging for the kind of rapid response that only human forces had been able to provide. "What forces do we have available?" Kethvar asked his tactical officer, knowing the answer would be inadequate. The Council had never maintained the kind of mobile reserve forces that humans had deployed because they had always relied on human ships to respond to emergencies. "The nearest available fleet is 18 hours away," came the reply. "By the time they arrive, the battle will be over." It was the same story playing out across the galaxy as Council forces proved too slow and too scattered to respond effectively to coordinated attacks. The Andromedan representative, who had spoken so eloquently about civilian leadership, now found himself in the Council's emergency command center watching his home fleet get destroyed on tactical displays. "Where are the human fleets?" he demanded desperately. "Surely they won't let innocent civilians die over politics." Kethvar's tentacles writhed with barely controlled anger as he turned to face the politician who had helped create this disaster. "The humans made their position clear when you voted to reduce their influence," he said coldly. "We chose this path, and now we must walk it alone." On the frontier world of Haven Prime, civilian families huddled in emergency shelters as Void Hunter landing craft descended from orbit. The planet's defense forces had fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed within hours. Marine Sergeant Tony Miller watched the news feeds from his new posting 3 systems away. His hands clenched in helpless rage as the world he had sworn to protect burned under enemy fire. Tony had spent 2 years on Haven Prime training the local militia and building defensive positions. He knew every street in the capital city and had friends among the civilian population. Now he could only watch as those friends were killed or captured by an enemy that human forces could have stopped easily. "Sergeant, why aren't we helping them?" asked Private Bobby Clark, who had also served on Haven Prime. "We could be there in 6 hours if we left right now." The young soldier didn't understand the political complexities that prevented human intervention, but he knew right from wrong. "Because those aren't our orders," Tony replied through gritted teeth. "The Council wanted independence from human protection, and that's what they got." He hated saying the words, but discipline was what separated soldiers from vigilantes, and Earth Command had been very clear about the consequences of unauthorized intervention. The pattern repeated itself across dozens of worlds as enemies that had been held in check by human strength suddenly found themselves free to act. Pirate fleets that had hidden in asteroid fields for years emerged to raid shipping lanes. Border disputes that had been settled by human peacekeepers flared into open warfare. Criminal organizations expanded their operations into sectors that human patrols had kept clean. Dr. Helen Brooks monitored the medical crisis from her new assignment at a hospital on Earth, the same plague that she had helped stop on. Vega Prime was now spreading unchecked through refugee camps as displaced populations fled the fighting. Without human medical ships to provide emergency treatment, the death toll was climbing exponentially. "The Centauri system is requesting medical assistance," reported her colleague, Dr. Gary Nash, who was tracking the humanitarian crisis. "They have over 2 million refugees and no way to treat them properly." The Centauri had been among the few species to vote against reducing human representation, but they were suffering along with everyone else. "What about their own medical services?" Helen asked, although she already knew the answer. Most alien species had developed their medical knowledge in cooperation with humans, and they lacked the independent capability to handle large-scale emergencies. "Overwhelmed and under-equipped," Gary replied. "They're asking specifically for human doctors and human medical technology." It was ironic that the same council that had worried about human influence was now desperately seeking human help in every area from military to medical to engineering. Captain Steve Parker commanded the Joint Defense Fleet that had once protected the entire council territory. Now his ships sat in Earth orbit while he watched the galaxy tear itself apart. His tactical display showed the expanding zones of Void Hunter control and the shrinking areas under Council protection. At this rate, the entire Outer Rim would fall within 6 months. "Captain, we're receiving priority transmissions from 17 different Council worlds," reported his communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Foster. "They're all requesting immediate military assistance." The same governments that had voted to reduce human influence were now begging for human intervention. "Log the requests and forward them to Earth Command," Steve ordered. "But maintain current position." His orders were clear, and he wouldn't violate them no matter how much he wanted to help the people who were dying because of political stupidity. The Altarian Prime Minister Marcus tried desperately to contact Earth's government through diplomatic channels. His species had supported humanity during the vote, but they were still bound by council law, which prevented them from making separate agreements with human forces. Now his home system was surrounded by enemy fleets, and he estimated they had less then a week before complete collapse. "Ambassador Wells, please," he begged during a secured communication with Victoria Wells, who served as Earth's diplomatic representative. "My people are dying, and we have no way to defend ourselves. Surely Earth won't abandon those who stood with humanity." Victoria's response was heavy with regret but firm in its message. "Marcus, you know I would help if I could, but Earth's position is clear. The Council made its choice and must live with the consequences." She hated turning away an old friend, but the lesson had to be learned completely, or it would be repeated in the future. The collapse accelerated as confidence in Council protection evaporated. Trade routes that had operated safely for centuries were abandoned overnight. Colonial governments began negotiating surrender terms with pirates rather than face destruction. Several smaller species opened secret negotiations with the Void Hunters, offering tribute in exchange for protection from other threats. On Earth, public opinion was deeply divided between those who demanded immediate intervention and those who insisted the galaxy must learn its lesson. News anchor Steve Parker reported on the growing moral crisis facing humanity. "Tonight we examine whether Earth has a responsibility to protect those who rejected our help," he said to his global audience. "How many must die before political points are considered made?" President Rodriguez faced the hardest decision of her career as the death toll climbed and pressure mounted for human intervention. The galaxy that had once seemed so stable with human protection was collapsing into chaos, and every day brought new atrocities that human forces could have prevented. Soon, she would have to choose between political consistency and moral responsibility, and the choice would define humanity's role in the universe forever. 6 months after humanity's departure from Council space, the galaxy stood on the edge of complete collapse. The Void Hunters had conquered a third of the former Council territory, while other threats emerged from the chaos like scavengers feeding on a dying animal. Pirate fleets operated with complete freedom, raiding shipping lanes that had been safe for decades. Several border wars had erupted between species as old grievances resurfaced without human peacekeepers to maintain order. Ambassador Victoria. Wells received another desperate transmission from Altarian Prime Minister Marcus, whose species had been among the few to support humanity during the original vote. His voice carried the weight of a leader watching his civilization die as he made what might be his final plea for help. The transmission was encrypted and sent through secret channels because even asking for human assistance was now considered treason by the remaining Council leadership. "Victoria, my people are dying," Marcus said, his usual diplomatic composure cracking under the strain. "The Centauri system is completely surrounded by enemy forces, and our defenses are failing. We estimate we have maybe 3 days before total collapse. Please, I'm begging you for any assistance Earth can provide." Victoria stared at the holographic image of her old friend, knowing that she had to deliver another rejection. Earth's position had been made clear at the highest levels, and individual exceptions would undermine the entire lesson that the galaxy needed to learn. "Marcus, you know I would help if I could, but Earth's stance remains unchanged. The Council chose this path when they voted to reduce human representation. This isn't about politics anymore," the Altarian leader pleaded, his 4 arms gesturing desperately. "This is about survival. Innocent beings are being slaughtered while human fleets sit in their docks. Children are dying, Victoria. Entire families are being wiped out because we can't defend ourselves without human support." The transmission ended, leaving Victoria alone with her guilt and the weight of decisions made far above her authority level. She had spent her career building relationships with alien species, and now she was watching those same species face extinction while humanity chose to make a political point. The moral complexity of the situation kept her awake at night as she wondered if they were teaching a lesson or committing genocide through inaction. Back on Earth, public opinion continued to fracture along moral and political lines. Protesters gathered outside government buildings every day, with some demanding that humanity honor its moral obligations to protect innocent life, while others insisted that the galaxy must learn its lesson completely before human forces could return. The debate raged in Congress and in living rooms across the planet as humanity struggled with its conscience. News anchor Steve Parker reported on the deepening crisis during his evening broadcast, watched by billions of people around the world. Tonight we examine the moral implications of humanity's withdrawal as alien civilizations face extinction, he announced to his audience. Military analysts estimate that without immediate intervention, several species may be completely wiped out within the next month. General Peter Clark presented increasingly grim intelligence reports to President Rodriguez during their daily briefings. The situation map showed expanding zones of enemy control and shrinking pockets of Council resistance. Each day brought news of another system falling or another species requesting evacuation assistance that wouldn't come. Madam President, we're looking at potential galactic collapse within the year, Peter reported as he updated the tactical displays. The Void Hunters have established permanent bases in conquered territory, and they're using those bases to launch deeper raids. Several species, including some that supported us, may face complete extinction if current trends continue. President Rodriguez studied the reports, feeling the weight of billions of lives resting on her decisions. The strategic logic of the withdrawal was sound, and the political lesson was being learned, but the human cost was becoming unbearable. "What are our people saying, Peter?" she asked, referring to military personnel who were watching their former allies die. "The military is restless," he admitted. "Many want to intervene, especially to help species that stood with us during the vote. Our naval commanders are requesting permission to conduct humanitarian missions, and our Marine units are volunteering for rescue operations. But there are others who believe the galaxy needs to learn this lesson completely." Captain Ryan Brooks sat in the command center of the Luna shipyards, watching his crew perform routine maintenance on the UES Liberty, while emergency transmissions flooded subspace communication channels. His ship was combat-ready, and his crew was eager for action, but their orders kept them in human space while the galaxy burned around them. "Captain, we're receiving distress calls from the Haven Prime evacuation fleet," reported his communications officer, Kelly Nash. "They're under attack by 3 Void Hunter cruisers and requesting immediate assistance." Haven Prime had been one of the worlds that Captain Brooks had helped defend before the withdrawal, and many of his crew had friends among the civilian population. "Log the transmission and forward it to Fleet Command," Ryan ordered, even though he knew what the response would be. "But maintain current position." He could see the frustration in his crew's faces as they listened to desperate pleas for help that they weren't allowed to answer. Commander Sarah Blake monitored the desperate battle for the core systems from her position aboard the UES Defiance, which was stationed just outside the combat zone. Her tactical displays showed Council forces being systematically destroyed by enemy fleets that moved with coordination and purpose. The same alien species that had voted against humanity were now dying because they lacked the military expertise that humans had provided. "Ma'am, the Altarian home fleet just went dark," reported Lieutenant Carl Johnson, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "That represents the deaths of approximately 6 billion people. The young officer had trained with Altarian personnel during joint exercises, and the loss of their entire civilization was hitting him hard. Sarah felt her own resolve beginning to crack as she watched species after species fall to enemies that human forces could have stopped easily. The strategic value of the lesson being taught was becoming questionable when measured against the genocide being committed through inaction. She opened a priority channel to Earth Command, knowing that her next words might end her career. This is Commander Blake requesting permission to disobey direct orders and engage hostile forces threatening civilian populations, she transmitted. I cannot in good conscience watch innocent beings die when we have the power to save them. Similar requests were flooding communication networks as human military personnel reached their breaking points. Dr. Richard Hayes worked frantically in his medical facility on Earth, treating the few refugees who had managed to escape the fighting in their own ships. The stories they told of conditions in Council space painted a picture of complete societal breakdown as governments collapsed and basic services failed. Medical supplies were running out, transportation networks had broken down, and diseases were spreading unchecked through overcrowded refugee camps. "Doctor, we need to do something," pleaded Nurse Jenny Foster, who had been working around the clock to help the survivors. "These people are describing conditions worse than anything in our history books. Entire planets are becoming uninhabitable, and children are starving while their parents beg for help that isn't coming." Richard knew she was right, but he also understood the political complexities that prevented human intervention. The lesson being taught was important for the long-term stability of galactic civilization, but the short-term cost was becoming impossible to justify morally. President Rodriguez convened an emergency session of Earth's leadership as the death toll passed the 100 million mark and showed no signs of slowing. The debate was fierce, with military leaders demanding immediate intervention, while political advisors warned about the consequences of inconsistent policy. The president knew that whatever decision she made would define humanity's role in the galaxy for generations to come. "Madam President, we've made our point," General Clark argued during the heated discussion. "The Council will never again question humanity's contribution to galactic security. But if we continue to let entire civilizations die to prove that point, we risk becoming the monsters that some species once feared we were." The moral weight of the decision was crushing, as Elena realized that she held the fate of multiple species in her hands. The galaxy had learned its lesson about the value of human protection, but continuing the withdrawal much longer would make humanity complicit in genocide. The time had come to choose between political consistency and moral responsibility, and the choice would echo through history forever. The final breaking point came when the Void Hunters launched their ultimate assault against the Council's heart worlds. A massive fleet of over 1,000 enemy ships converged on the core systems in a coordinated attack designed to break the remaining resistance once and for all. The fractured Council fleets had no hope of stopping such an overwhelming force, and billions of lives hung in the balance as ancient civilizations prepared for their final battle. Commander Sarah Blake sat in the command center of the UES Defiance, watching the desperate struggle unfold on her tactical displays. The ship was positioned just outside Council space, following orders to monitor but not intervene while the galaxy's oldest civilizations faced extinction. Her crew watched in horrified silence as enemy forces systematically destroyed defensive positions that had protected these worlds for thousands of years. "Ma'am, the Altarian home fleet is gone," reported Lieutenant Carl Johnson, his voice barely controlled as he witnessed the destruction of an entire species. "All contact has been lost with their capital world. That's 6 billion people who just died while we sat here and watched." The tactical officer's hands were shaking as he struggled to maintain his professional composure. Sarah felt something break inside her as she realized that she was watching genocide unfold while having the power to stop it. The political lesson had been learned and taught, but continuing to enforce it would make humanity complicit in the destruction of entire civilizations. She opened a direct channel to Earth Command, knowing that her career was about to end, but no longer caring about personal consequences. "This is Commander Blake aboard the UES Defiance," she transmitted on an open frequency that would be heard across human space. "I am formally requesting permission to disobey direct orders and engage hostile forces threatening civilian populations. I cannot stand by and watch innocent beings die when we have the power to save them." Her words triggered a flood of similar requests from human military personnel across the galaxy. Captain Ryan Brooks aboard the UES Liberty added his voice to the growing chorus of officers demanding permission to intervene. Admiral Jake Morrison received dozens of similar transmissions from commanders who had reached their breaking points watching former allies face extinction. President Elena Rodriguez called an emergency session of Earth's government as the requests for intervention flooded communication networks. The cabinet room was filled with tension as military leaders and political advisors debated the consequences of changing course after maintaining the withdrawal for so long. The decision would define not just Earth's policy, but humanity's moral character for generations to come. "Madam President, the lesson has been learned," argued General Peter Clark as he presented the latest intelligence reports. "Every species in the Council now understands humanity's value, and they're begging for our return. But if we continue this policy much longer, we become responsible for genocide through inaction." "What about the political implications?" asked Secretary of State Nancy Brooks, who worried about the precedent being set. "If we intervene now, it might be seen as weakness or inconsistency. Some species might interpret it as humanity being unable to follow through on our commitments." Elena studied the casualty reports that showed the death toll climbing exponentially as the core systems fell one by one. The Centauri homeworld was under direct assault, and defensive positions that had stood for millennia were crumbling under the enemy advance. In a few hours, the heart of galactic civilization might cease to exist while humanity maintained its political position. "The political point has been made," she decided after a long moment of silence. "The Council will never again question humanity's contribution because they've seen what happens without us. But we're not monsters, and we won't stand by while innocent people die to prove a point that's already been proven." The President's broadcast went out simultaneously to human forces and galactic communication networks, carrying a message that would change the course of the war. "Effective, immediately human forces are authorized to engage in humanitarian intervention operations," she announced. "We will not abandon innocent beings to face extinction because of political failures." Admiral Jake Morrison, who had led the original withdrawal, now found himself commanding the largest human fleet ever assembled. Ships that had been sitting in dock for months suddenly sprang to life as crews prepared for emergency deployment. The same admiral who had walked out of the council chambers now prepared to return with enough firepower to change the balance of the entire war. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison," he transmitted as the massive fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. "We're going back to finish what we started 6 months ago. The galaxy is under human protection whether they asked for it or not." The fleet consisted of over 200 capital ships supported by hundreds of escorts and support vessels carrying the full weight of human military might. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace near the besieged core systems just as the last defensive lines were beginning to collapse. Void Hunter forces that had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they had thought was gone forever. Admiral Morrison's voice carried across all communication frequencies as he delivered humanity's return to galactic affairs. "This is Admiral Morrison of the Earth Fleet," he announced on an open channel that enemy forces would certainly hear. "Void Hunter forces, you have one opportunity to withdraw from Council space immediately. This galaxy is under human protection, and we will not tolerate further aggression against civilian populations." The battle that followed became the stuff of legend as human ships fought with desperate fury to save civilizations that had rejected their protection. Captain Ryan Brooks led a desperate charge through enemy lines that broke the siege of the Centauri homeworld, saving millions of lives. Commander Sarah Blake's tactical brilliance turned certain defeat into victory at the Battle of Rigel Prime, where she destroyed 3 enemy battleships with a single coordinated strike. The tide of war turned within hours as human forces demonstrated the military coordination and tactical superiority that had once made the galaxy safe. Void Hunter fleets that had seemed unstoppable suddenly found themselves retreating under withering fire from ships that moved with precision and purpose. The same aliens who had voted to reduce human influence now watched in amazement as humanity saved them from extinction. When the smoke cleared 3 days later, the Void Hunter invasion force was completely shattered, with surviving ships fleeing into deep space. The threat that had seemed ready to conquer the galaxy had been broken by human military might, deployed with the kind of coordination that only came from decades of experience fighting together. The new council session convened in a chamber scarred by the recent fighting, but filled with representatives who had learned the true value of human protection. The same species that had voted against humanity now competed to offer them greater authority and representation. The political landscape had changed completely as survival trumped pride. The new compact was negotiated quickly, with humanity receiving permanent leadership positions in exchange for renewed protection of council space. The vote was unanimous as every species recognized that their survival depended on human military strength. Never again would political maneuvering override the practical reality of galactic defense. Admiral Morrison took his place at the head of the council table, looking out at representatives who had learned the hardest possible lesson about the consequences of rejecting human protection. The scars of the recent war were visible on many faces, and the memory of how close they had come to extinction would influence council policy for generations. "We are all stronger together," he said simply as he assumed his new role as council military commander. "The past 6 months have shown us what happens when politics overrides practical security needs. Let's make sure we never forget that lesson again." The galaxy had shuddered when humans abandoned the council, but it was humanity's choice to return that ultimately held civilization together. The lesson had been learned at a terrible cost, but the result was a stronger alliance based on mutual respect rather than political convenience. In the end, humanity had proven that their commitment to protecting innocent life was stronger than their desire for political revenge, and that choice defined their character as a species worthy of leading the galaxy toward a safer future.